Hello, my name's Duncan Fleming and I teach Hermetic Kabbalah, and I'm going to be talking about the illusions on the Tree of Life. So the Tree of Life is a system that represents the whole of reality as a living organism. And like any living organism, it's made up of various unique, separate parts, each of which performs a particular role. So the illusions that follow are a set of correspondences which relate to the 10 spheres on the Tree of Life. They're relatively modern in origin, no more than 40 or 50 years old, and some of the concepts are already established in philosophy and psychology. Our experience of the world is undeniably distorted by the process of our own perception. Imagine for a second that you're walking down a busy city street. There's far too much happening in all the hustle and bustle for you to be completely aware of everything that's going on. And although only a thin sliver of the overall totality of what's happening in the street ever gets through, still a great deal of raw, unprocessed information is reaching your nervous system via your sense organs. And out of that very great mountain of information, only a small amount is going to pass into the threshold of your conscious awareness. And this is the point at which you might begin to notice and describe what's happening to yourself, converting all of that information into more or less recognizable chunks. And out of these chunks of recognition, you might then begin to interpret and describe to yourself what is happening and weave it into a kind of internal narrative. And who knows, maybe 24 hours from now, you might only be left with a faint recollection of what actually happened. In a few weeks, it's unlikely you'll remember anything at all other than perhaps the faintest impression of what was happening as you were walking down the street. So we're limited by the structure of our own very highly specialized nervous systems. And at each successive level of abstraction or taking away from the whole of reality, new distortions are introduced. And that's not to say that our experience of the world is entirely made up of illusions, but just that distortions in our perception brought about by the process of abstraction are fairly inevitable. If we were driving a car and all the dials on the dashboard were providing incorrect information, we would be very likely to run into trouble. So it's really in our own interest to remove as much of the distortion and illusion from our lives as possible. And the first step in this process is to become more aware of what those distortions are. Malkut, all that is physical. In order to survive as a physical being, we need to pay very close attention to the information that we are receiving from our sensory organs. Light bounces off and emits from objects in our vicinity and then reaches our optical nerves in our eyes. And from this we create a constant visual map of our surroundings. And likewise, sound waves that reach our ears, along with our other senses, help us to build up a picture of what's going on in the physical world around us. But this information can only really tell us about the exterior reality of our environment. Our picture of the world is constructed out of a multitude of impressions that consist entirely of the outsides of things. And the interior reality of what it's like to actually be something other than ourselves, like another human being or even an animal or an object, can never be known directly via our sensory impressions alone. The scientific method, being a systematic empirical study of the physical world built up over several centuries, has definitely helped us to stay warm, to be healthy, comfortable, and even to stay entertained and amused, and we owe a great deal of our well-being to science and technology. But it's worth making a distinction between the scientific method, which works on the assumption that there is a real knowable world out there that rational beings might be able to agree on, and a more formal kind of scientific realism which goes quite a bit further in making very bold claims about the actual ontological status of external reality. Scientific realism can be seen as being in very sharp contrast to those idealistic philosophies that claim we're really living in a world of mere illusion and apparition, and that the universe is essentially immaterial and just a construct within mind. So we've got two extreme views. In one extreme view, only the external world as known to us through our senses is recognized as being real. And in the other extreme view, only the inner world of conscious awareness is considered to be real. But of course, there's less dualistic ways of looking at life that recognize the validity of both the inside and the outside of reality, and we can look at these later. One danger in believing simply that the world described by science is the real world is that it tends to substitute the ineffably complex reality of what's actually going on with a consensus view that's made up of a bunch of commonly accepted working theories about what's going on. And likewise, it's rarely useful or even possible for scientists to examine the phenomenology, the inner experience of the world. We might be able to hook somebody up to brain imaging apparatus while they're meditating and see perhaps unusual neurological activity. But again, that's just looking at the outside of things. Our thoughts have got a physical, measurable, observable correlate that can be measured. But these are not really exactly the same thing as the experience of actually having those thoughts. And neither are they completely separate. They're the inside and the outside of the same thing. A distortion arises when we start to believe that the external world is more real and that our internal experience is less real. It might be that the nature of mind is such that it cannot really remain still and quiet for very long. It's always intentional, it's always directed towards some or other kind of internal or external form, always having to be aware of this or that. And certainly the human mind's most valiant attempts to simulate nothingness tend to involve visualizing expanses of blackness, which of course is still something. So our everyday reality is heavily influenced by that post-enlightenment scientific method, and this everyday reality places an enormous emphasis on information that reaches us via our physical sense organs, i.e. what we can see, hear and touch, etc. Even when this involves using sophisticated measuring devices or ultra-powerful microscopes, for instance, it's still ultimately preoccupied with looking at the outside of things, how they appear as objects in the physical world. Introspection has taken an increasingly backseat role in the pursuit of knowledge in comparison with advances in, say, neurology and brain science. If a person reports that they've had an experience that contradicts consensus reality, then a scientific, logical response would be to place the burden of proof on those persons or that person to devise some kind of reliable experiment which can repeatedly and reliably demonstrate that that consensus reality is wrong. And of course, this level of scientific rigor makes it virtually impossible to demonstrate proofs for internal experiences which are of a numinous or a spiritual or a transcendental nature. That vast tower of multi-dimensional reality collapses down into a single-story dwelling where we fall prey to the illusion that the only reality is physical reality. Many people are convinced that consciousness itself is just an epiphenomenon, an accidental byproduct of those chemical processes going on in the wetware of our brain. Traditional Kabbalah has got a term for when reality becomes devoid of inner meaning and just appears to be a meaningless array of outer experiences. And that term is klipot, which means empty shells. And this ultimately is the danger of the illusion of Malkut. When we end up living in a world of empty shells, where everything has an outside, but we can't believe that there's really anything there on the inside. And of course there is the opposite illusion, that of spiritual idealism, where we might believe that the physical world is a complete illusion and that we're entirely made up of mind stuff. So our challenge then is to discriminate between the real and the unreal and get to grips with the hard and heavy realities of the physical world. Ultimately, we can't bypass the lessons of our physical incarnation. We keep waking up in our bodies over and over again. We have to take care of our physical needs and look after our bodies. Like the flame that rises up from a candle, that aspect of our spirit which lives in the non-physical worlds requires our body and nervous system in order to do its thing. Take away the body physical, and a great deal of what we cherish as our self disappears too. Yesod, security. Considering that Yesod is a strong foundation that somehow weaves and binds together the rest of the world and receives and funnels all the influences of the other spheres above, it still manages at the same time to be incredibly ephemeral and illusory. Initial experiences of Yesod are usually all about appearance, glamour, and transformation. Sometimes we encounter Yesod as a magical hall of mirrors or secret tunnels, and when we first go exploring in the bowels of our own mind, Yesod somehow manages to make them appear to be like a shimmering, fascinating, glamorous, seductive labyrinth of dreams. Indeed, the spiritual experience of Yesod is that of a vision of the machinery of the universe. Now, from the perspective of being at the very nadir of the involutionary arc, i.e. when we've completed the path of descent from spirit into dense matter, it appears to us that we can experience and understand the entire universe. Because Yesod is towards the base of the pillar of consciousness, it acts as a kind of receptacle for the emanations that are above, and then channels all of the influences of the upper spheres so that we can perceive them in a recognizable form. But what we're really seeing are just reflections in the mirror of Yesod. We create a simulacrum of the universe in our own imagination. And because we're creating it for ourselves, we can make it as neat and tidy as we want. It's only when we begin the outward journey of continuing evolution up the tree of life that we upset the apple cart, and we have to let this illusion go and encounter the upper sephirot for real. We know that making repetitive patterns will produce a groove that makes tasks get easier and easier. At first, we might be aware of these patterns, and then after a while they'll start to become so stereotypical that our focused awareness will start to seek novelty and begin to notice other things. What was once at the very forefront of our emerging consciousness is now taken for granted. It's become a given, and in a way we're like spiders that are wandering around on a web of our own making. And these webs appear to have always been there, and it seems as if they always will be there in the future. However, they're constantly being destroyed and recreated. The illusion of security is that things are going to stay the same, that our usually comfortable headspace will fundamentally remain unchanged. And yet we all need a place to live, whether it's a house or a castle, a cell or a cocoon or a cave or a tent in the desert. The shelter that we live in must be at least temporarily stable and secure. And it's got to protect us from the raw power of the elements. But no matter how strong or secure our shelters seem, they can never be permanent constructions. In time, every tower has got to crumble. Our egos can create a false identity that's comforting, but we'll talk about this more when we discuss the illusion of Tiferet. At the level of Yesod, ego tends to fight back with a vengeance whenever it's challenged. For example, if we encounter somebody who's evidently cleverer or more talented than us in some way, or who excels in a skill, in a capacity that we like to think we've got, then we might feel an unreasonable urge to undermine them somehow, instead of simply accepting that this is so. We might feel unduly threatened, because actually on some level our very existence might be at stake. And this inevitably stops real change. The cocoon of our ego becomes a prison cell, and we get trapped in our own protective shell. and we all need to undergo major changes from time to time, and that process can be more or less traumatic depending on how attached we are to the status quo of our current situation. The only way we can really overcome the illusion of security is by learning to trust in the foundation of our being. And that's not to say we should blithely ignore the fact that there is pain and suffering and confusion in the world, but we have to learn to trust in ourselves, both in our intrinsic good nature and in the strength of good that there is in the unfolding, self-righting nature of reality. Hod, rigid order. On the tree of life, Hod is situated at the base of the pillar of form. Higher up the tree, we might encounter form as the all-embracing containment of Bina, or the limits and boundaries and law of Gevura. But in Hod, form manifests as an ever-increasing granularity and detail in complex structures, and the capacity to differentiate and categorize all those different aspects of the world. More importantly, our own Hod gives us the ability to make maps out of the world, and if we're not careful, to live in them rather than in the world as it really is. Hod provides us with information rather than knowledge. If we think of a human being as being a microcosm of the whole universe, and therefore as being a tree of life in their own right, then a person's Hod manifests as intellectual capacity and the ability to hold and construct beliefs about how the world is, including memories of how the world used to be and plans about how the world might be in the future. These beliefs range from our core assumptions about the nature of how things are to everyday working assumptions about what's going on. Because the world's changing all the time, it's really important that we're able to flexibly adapt our beliefs and maps of the world as an ongoing process. When we don't have personal experience of something, we tend to look to established forms of learning for answers, i.e. in books and libraries, and from established authorities such as university professors or the sages of antiquity. Because Hod's at the very base of the pillar of form, it tends to relate to learning in a fairly passive way, a negative way, rather like a pupil would respond to a teacher. And in the Western mystery tradition, historically, there's been a very strong tendency towards unquestioning deference to figures of authority. Typically, grimoires and magical books like the Picatrix will instruct us that such and such a plant belongs to such and such a planet because such and such a sage says that it does. And we might be able to respond quite easily to some of the more obvious pre-rational, pre-modern, pre-scientific magical material in an intelligent way, while still making use of the tradition. But far more insidious and difficult to tackle are the root assumptions about the fundamental nature of reality that we've received from our tradition. Without wanting to remove the core sense of design and purpose in the world that underpins Hermetic Kabbalah, it is based on some ancient teleology that might need to be developed further in order to integrate it with more recent developments in our understanding of the world. So, a few more thoughts about mapping. Maps don't show absolutely every detail about the territory that they represent, but rather only those things that are relevant to the map's purpose. A good map is a deliberate act of abstraction. So we need to be conscious abstractors, aware of the nature and purpose of the maps that we're creating. The illusion of Hod is that of rigid order, and partly this is about getting mixed up between our representation of reality and the reality itself, and then believing that when reality contradicts our own internal map, the reality must be wrong. Some so-called rational people can have very fixed beliefs which are actually irrational. One's ideas can get calcified over time, just like stone, and become rigid. Another component of this illusion is the misconception that analysis is somehow equivalent to control. i.e., because we're able to dissect things in our heads and break them down into their component parts, that somehow we have control over them. Admittedly, this is an important process in developing technology and ability to work in the world, but our HOD function doesn't always realize when it's out of its own depth. And this is especially so when the intellect attempts to analyze the emotions. I'm not talking here about using a cognitive behavioral approach to be more aware of one's own dysfunctional schema, but rather that peculiar tension that occurs when we're overwhelmed by a really strong feeling, and instead of simply accepting and experiencing our emotional state until it moves on, we try and dispel the uncomfortable feeling by retreating into our intellect and analyzing it to death, trying to verbalize the non-verbal, trying to convert feelings into words because words are easier to manipulate. What is this that I'm feeling? What's the reason for this? There must be a reason. I must understand the process. Again, the illusion of HOD occurs when we believe that by relentlessly analyzing something, we can have some kind of control over it. It's worth noting that sometimes people can start off very mentally flexible and then become worse over time. For example, experts who get stuck in the paradigm of the era in which they originally did their main research degrees or had their first breakthrough. And even though many further developments might have taken place in their field, they feel a very special affinity and attachment to all the hard work they did at a particular time, at a particular place in the past. And so they're unable to move on and move with the times. The illusion of HOD can become a trap and lead us into negative, self-fulfilling prophecies. Our beliefs affect our perceptions, which in turn reinforce our beliefs. So what's the antidote to the illusion of rigid order? Well, we need to remember that Mercury is a trickster. We need to be aware of our own fallible mapping process. We can develop an increased awareness of our own belief systems. And meditation can help here. And one surprisingly powerful self-hypnotic method is to visualize a large garden representing one's beliefs. Inside the garden, there's a multitude of flowers and plants and trees growing, and each of them represents an idea or belief that we hold. By going in and cultivating the garden through planting and pruning and weeding and so on, we're actually changing the way we think, and this can carry over into our everyday life, creating permanent beneficial changes. And we can also practice something called counter-attitudinal advocacy. That is, spending time deliberately playing devil's advocate, thinking about and appreciating beliefs which run counter to our own. The cognitive dissonance that this produces can actually lead to a moderation of our more strongly held views. But ultimately, the illusion of rigid order needs to be shattered if we're going to continue a pattern of lifelong learning and be of use to the powers that be. Netzach, projection. Netzach is both the partner and the polar opposite of HOD, and so, as you'd expect, the illusion of Netzach is linked to the illusion of HOD, but in relation to the sphere of emotions. It's the feeling that one knows or recognizes what the world and the people in it are really like, and it's distorted by our own needs and desires, leading to the illusion of projection. It's from the sphere of Netzach that we evaluate the world, as in we project our own values onto people, places and things, and then judge them accordingly. Netzach, being at the base of the pillar of force, deals with energies and forces. It's fluid and energetic, and although it can be illusory, it's often connected with genuine empathy and sympathy, so it can be a force for unselfish love or of appalling selfishness, depending on the circumstances. Because at the level of Netzach, we're still looking for something or someone from outside that's going to be our salvation, that will somehow bring us back into a state of grace and well-being. We're looking for something to help us feel connected and whole and complete. Because when we don't have a conscious connection with the upper Sephirot, we feel like we're missing out on something vitally important. And so this projection is based on desire, but it still might contain flickers of real intuition and inspiration, and this makes it even more seductive and compelling. Where projection occurs in relationships, it leads to a kind of emotional fusing, whereby it becomes virtually impossible to really tell where one person ends and the other person begins. In intimate relationships, it can be really hard to resist the inclination to project one's own expectations onto one's partner. So there's a key concept in the psychology of Carl Jung, which is that of the major archetypes. And one of these major archetypes is that of the anima, or the idealized woman. Now, the anima actually exists somewhere out in the noumenal realm of the collective unconscious, but she's activated when a typically heterosexual male feels that he cannot live out his own feminine qualities, and they become to an extent repressed. And because of this repression, he begins unconsciously to project out his own anima, i.e. what he thinks a woman should be like, onto any poor female that he becomes intimately involved with, irrespective of her actual personality. He might have an expectation for her to demonstrate all sorts of sensitivity, glamour, and nurturing abilities that he feels that he cannot himself manifest because of his maleness. And likewise, she may in turn project an equivalent archetypal counterpart onto him, that of the animus, the idealized male, and then expect him to be her knight in shining armor, everything she feels that males ought to be, but of course she can't be because she's a real woman. Anima-animus projection isn't only limited to traditional gender roles. It occurs in same-sex relationships and in couples who like to think of themselves as very liberated and modern. One can end up responding to an archetype of man or woman rather than to an actual loved one as a real person. And we can see how this might cause all sorts of problems and is a basically insidious and selfish process. There are lots of other types of emotional projection, and they all pretty much involve displacing the aspects of our own personality which have not been integrated onto other people, places and things. The two most salient ones to mention here also are the persona and the shadow. The persona is literally our mask. It's the plausible version of ourselves that we present to the outside world. It includes all of what we see as our positive traits and qualities, and it's designed to make an impression. But if we're not careful, we can start to believe the hype and think that we actually are our own persona. The persona can manifest in people who think of themselves as spiritual in the form of relentless self-improvement, because they will not allow for their own human frailty. They might even make a projection of a vision of perfection onto a parent or a lover or a teacher. The flip side of the persona is the shadow, which is the archetype of all that dark stuff we most certainly do not want other people to know about us. Not everyone's shadow is a devil-type character. For somebody who outwardly presents as being powerful and ruthless and Machiavellian, their shadow might actually be weak and vulnerable. When the shadow is unconscious, it's usually encountered in a projected form as other people's faults. Indeed, when other people's personality traits really wind us up, it can help us learn much more about our own shadow side. It's also worth paying attention to the way that societies create semi-mythological pariahs like Bin Laden and then turn them into folk devils, because this says a lot about the collective shadow of the societies that we live in. Apart from the heavy power play of the major archetypes, we need to be aware that working with Netzach is immensely energetic, and this energy creates very strong emotions. And we all know that mood and emotions are going to colour our perception of the world and the people in it. when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you, or at least it appears to. We project our own mood onto other people. If there's any antidote to the illusion of Netzach, it's a combination of unselfishness, which must begin with a stark recognition of just exactly how selfish we are, and responsibility, which, as well as being to do with taking ownership of one's own stuff, is also a combination of the words response and ability, or in other words, an ability to respond to changing circumstances. And indeed, we'll know victory when we begin to respond unselfishly to other people and to the world we encounter. Tiferet, identification. Identification as the illusion of Tiferet relates to our own sense of identity and is at the very core of what we think we are. We might identify with any number of the roles that we play in life and say, I am a lover, I am a parent, I am a such and such worker. And our other identifications might be slightly more aspirational, such as, I'm an artistic genius, or I am the king or the queen of the witches. Some self-identifications can even be negative and debilitating. For example, I am a failure, I am a bad person. We might also identify with our body, with our dreams and imagination, with our beliefs, or with our feelings. But these things are all liable to change. So at some level, identifications are a cocktail of emotion, belief, imagination, and behavior that all really belong on the lower part of the tree of life, but which we attribute to our real self in Tiferet. So some 20th century existential philosophers, notably Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, were concerned precisely with this illusion, and they used the term bad faith to describe the process in which a person gradually forfeits their ability to act with genuine authenticity and freedom because they've replaced their sense of self with all sorts of false norms and values, shoulds and oughts. Now, any attempt to remove the props of the false self will inevitably be met with much resistance because it can be extremely painful and difficult to confront the potentially abysmal sense of emptiness at the center of what we are. In fact, when the false self is dismantled, it can even lead to a kind of existentialist collapse for somebody who doesn't have any genuine connection with spirituality. And by spirituality, I most definitely do not mean religiosity or faith in other people's faith. This is about having an intimate and simple connection with reality itself in however limited a way. It's an awareness of that all-containing nothingness in which you, me, and everything that there's ever been is happening. You can't see it, you can't taste it, because it's not anything. Without this basic awareness, removing the illusion of identity leads to a horrible sense of hollowness, and to thoughts such as, if I'm not anything, then I must be nothing, i.e. nihilism. So to emphasize, no faith in other people's faith, no set of beliefs, no warm, fluffy feeling can act as a substitute for our own direct experience. Because that real experience is not something other or unknown. It's actually always been there for everyone at all times, hidden in the background, covered up by changing forms. And until we begin to dismantle the false self, the ground of our being is too absolute, is too simple, and too obvious even to be noticed through all the noise. The illusion of self-identity is also linked to the vice of Tiferet, which is pride. And nowadays pride is usually used in a very positive sense to do with having positive self-regard. So we're talking about something slightly different. I suppose we're all fairly good at something in life, even if it takes us half of our life to figure out what that is. And a lot of our life's achievements might actually be due to outside factors such as our genetic makeup, our family upbringing, our environment, community, where we grew up. And yet we tend to attribute our positive achievements, such as our material wealth, career success, and any particular skills that we've got, like eloquence or physical strength, as being somehow innate personal qualities that are just part of the inner us. It's all very normal, and actually we know that a self-serving attributional bias is quite important in maintaining normal, healthy self-esteem. However, when we start doing lots of work with Tiferet, we begin a process of amplifying this effect significantly. And this amplification can lead to some really serious false identification with a set of beliefs or behaviors. The vice of pride can be thought of as an over-attachment to the fruits of action. And indeed, pride can help us increase our motivation and performance. But all vices are ultimately vicious, and they need to be first accepted and then overcome. When we're genuinely committed to the work, then the powers that be will find ways of removing our false identification. And those usually involve bursting our heavily inflated bubbles of pride. Gevurah, invincibility. Gevurah is intrinsically formal and concerned with upholding the law and maintaining strong and firm boundaries. And this leads to a sense of permanence, that what is will always be. The illusion of Gevurah, that of invincibility, shares some traits with security in Yesod, but it can run even deeper. Teenagers continue to take up smoking at an alarming rate. Why? Is it because they're stupid? No, even really clever kids smoke. Is it because they don't know the risks? No, they've been bombarded with dire health warnings from a very early age, and they can reel them off in an instant. The reason why they take up such a dangerous activity is because they've no real sense of mortality. The idea of actually dying for them is just that. It's an idea. Now, even if we manage to avoid dementia and other debilitating long-term illnesses, at some point our bodies are definitely going to pack in and we're going to die, quite possibly in a great deal of pain. We'll lose everything that we currently cherish, our family, our friends, our possessions, our status, absolutely everything. And even though we already know this on some level, for the most part we act as if it's never going to happen. And this is the illusion of invincibility. And the illusion of invincibility is also about being convinced that we can win any battle. It can manifest as a kind of power fantasy. One example of this is the myth of progress, in which we are convinced that human ingenuity and technology will gradually conquer the chaotic forces of nature and subjugate the planet entirely to our will. Our sense of invincibility can be exaggerated significantly when fighting for a just cause or a righteous crusade. This sense of immortality comes from being fused with a higher principle, for example, a holy war. The higher principle taps into something which is transpersonal, but only on a tribal level. When we take the sword of Gevurah and use it to defend ourselves against perceived threats from other people, from nature itself even, then we're in danger of meting out our own judgment, and this can quickly degenerate into cruelty and into violence. So how strong are we really, and where does our strength actually come from? It certainly takes real strength and real courage to leave the sword alone. And yet there may be times when we need to invoke the power of the law, and occasions when we do need to defend important structures that are of great value. But we still need to be very careful that we're not acting out the illusion of Gevurah in the form of self-preservation. Hesed, infallibility. Part of the nature of leadership, especially of great leadership when operating out of Hesed, is the ability and the authority to actually decide what happens and to act as an author in the creative process of making reality, that is, reality on the lower face of the tree. The illusion of Hesed, then, is of infallibility, or that one is always right and simply cannot be wrong. The illusion comes about because even though Hasidic power transmits authority and acts in positive polarity to the Sephirot below, it's really meant to be more of a servant than a king. Hesed is actually meant to act as a giver and a benevolent transmitter of all that power and inspiration that it has itself received as a gift from the upper triad of Keter, Chokmah, and Bina. And Hesed is supposed to convert the upper influences, which in their raw, unprocessed nature would be too much for the lower spheres, into a perpetual, loving, kind, and merciful outpouring that sustains life itself. So although the role of Hesed is to give freely and leave all that controlling and shaping and management to the other Sephirot below, the sheer power of Hesed can easily go to one's head and bring about all sorts of nasty, overbearing vices, including bigotry, tyranny, hypocrisy, and gluttony. But the illusion of infallibility means that we're blind to these vices, because at that level, we may really think that we can do no wrong. And that's why the virtues of Hesed have to be obedience and humility, because only they can tell Hesed where it might be going wrong. Through obedience to the influence of the upper spheres and the humility to accept that everything that we have has been given to us freely as a gift and can be taken away just as easily. And of course, if we don't develop humility for ourselves, then life itself will teach us humility through various kinds of humiliation. Bina, death. I need to qualify everything that I say from here on in, because we're going to be considering the Sephirot on the upper face of the Tree of Life and talking about aspects of reality that are really beyond human experience, wisdom, and understanding. They're beyond the power of our minds to grasp. And so the limited knowledge that we have received has come through reflections and meditations rather than from the experience of everyday life. And therefore I'm quite simply not able to say quite as much about them without speculating. The illusion of Bina is death. Now we've said that the illusion of Gevurah is invincibility, so how can it be so that death itself is really an illusion? Well, the kind of death that we find so difficult to grasp in Gevurah is the death of form and of structure. And actually, only that which has taken on form and structure can really be destroyed. The actual ground of our being, the formless essence of life itself, remains, because it's not actually made of anything which can be changed or destroyed. And it's eternal because it's never actually entered into the time stream. And beyond all of that constituent forces and forms, we're fundamentally a part of that nothingness. Still, to have a process of creation, we have to have form as well as force in the mix. And at the root of all form is Bina. Bina wants to hold on to things forever and ever and ever. The spiritual experience of Bina is that of the vision of sorrow, in which we encounter the divine as a dark and sterile mother, or as a black and bitter sea. And eventually we all have to completely embrace the experience. Bina is represented by symbols of containment, like the coffin, the chalice, and the womb. And anything that is placed inside them undergoes a complete transformation. From the level of anything below Bina, i.e. from Hesed downwards, this is going to be a kind of death, because nothing will ever be the same ever again. There will be a complete loss of all that form and structure that we got used to. But from the position of Bina, it's going to be an experience of gestation, and because of that, death is an illusion. Chokmah, independence. Much lower down the tree of life, at the level of personality and ego, independence can be of great virtue. It can give us the ability to respond and think and act as individuals without being held back by a herd mentality or by our own negative patterns. But in Chokmah, we're way beyond all that. Chokmah emanates directly from Keter, the crown, which is the singular point of all creation. And because it emerges directly from Keter, Chokmah is able to see God face to face, so to speak, and can experience complete at-one-ment with the crown of unity, overcoming any illusion of separation. And yet Chokmah has two faces, one looking to God, and another which, as the Father of the universe, looks upon Bina and the rest of the tree, and in doing so pours out all of the force that seeds the universe. And it's from this aspect of Chokmah from which the illusion of independence springs. Because in the act of instigating the process of creation comes the initial split, comes the beginning of duality and the forming of an I-thou relationship with all that is. This is the beginning of the illusion of separation or independence. And although this illusion is way up there in Chokmah, it resonates with us humans down here too. We have to learn over and over again that we're never really truly independent or separate from the powers that be, and that we're continually being guided and directed by Spirit in everything that we do. Keter, attainment. So finally there's the illusion of Keter, which is that of attainment, or that there will ever be an ultimate end goal, a point in which we will have done everything possible and creation will be perfect and complete. Although perhaps the aspiration of attainment is not a bad thing in itself, in the same way that ancient mariners might navigate by a star, knowing that they would never really reach it, every civilization, including our own, has myths and stories about a heaven of perfection and rest, or a nirvana, a complete cessation of experience. And these myths might even refer to temporary states of consciousness, where we could rest in nothingness for a while, but we can't live there forever. In some traditions, there are even stories about spiritual beings that are there to help the recently deceased in their experience of the afterlife. Because sometimes people will get trapped in a place they imagined was a heaven, a place of ultimate attainment. But why do we keep coming back for more? Why do we keep doing this to ourselves over and over and over again, despite all the growing pains, the confusion and the suffering that seem to always accompany manifestation? Life has a phase of activity, and then it's followed by a phase of rest, and then another phase of activity. Just like the in-breath and the out-breath, just like the summer and the winter, just like life and death. Neither is permanent, and there doesn't need to be a final destination. And there doesn't need to be an ultimate purpose other than the unity and the sanctity of life itself. It just is what it is. And so I think I'll leave it there, and I hope that this talk on the illusions on the Tree of Life has been interesting. If you'd like to know more about Hermetic Kabbalah, then visit our website at www.rockwax.org.uk. Thank you.